decimal point. I do have the pleasure of introducing the lecturer today, Linda Darling-Hammond. Linda began her career in education, and I assume this is all correct, as a teacher's aide, progressed to a post as an English teacher, and began graduate work while working in the Education Law Center and the National Urban Coalition. Her distinguished research career continued at the RAND Corporation, where she ultimately directed the Education and Human Resources program. From there, she moved to Columbia University and directed the National Commission on Teaching and America's Future. About 8 years ago, she joined the Stanford faculty, where she is the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education, leads the School Redesign Network, and the Stanford Educational Leadership Institute. In addition, she sponsors the Stanford Teacher Education Program. A recitation of her awards and honors would substantially reduce the time we have available to hear Linda, but a review of her professional record is truly awe-inspiring. She has combined scholarship with action, clarity with eloquence, and flexibility with a career-long concern for the lives and effectiveness of teachers teaching students who need to learn. It is my great honor to present as distinguished lecturer and as my friend, Linda Darling-Hammond, whose lecture today is entitled Securing the Right to Learn, Policy and Practice for Powerful Teaching and Learning. Linda.
I'm delighted to be here. It's a difficult time in our nation and an important time for the issue of securing the right to learn. I think about the statement that W.B. Du Bois made in the darkening days of the early McCarthy era when he wrote, "Of all the civil rights for which the world has struggled and fought for 5,000 years, the right to learn is undoubtedly the most fundamental. The freedom to learn has been bought by bitter sacrifice, and whatever we may think of the curtailment of other civil rights, we should fight to the last ditch to keep open the right to learn, the right to have examined in our schools not only what we believe, but what we do not believe, not only what our leaders say, but what the leaders of other groups and nations and the leaders of other centuries have said. We must insist upon this to give our children the fairness of a start which will equip them with such an array of facts and such an attitude toward truth that they can have a real chance to judge what the world is and what its greater minds have thought it might be." Those words sound very poignant and appropriate today, as they did in 1949. Du Bois knew, as did Thomas Jefferson when he conceived our public education system, that America's capacity to survive as a democracy relies not only on the provision of free public education, it rests on the kind of education that arms people with an intelligence capable of free and independent thought. And providing most Americans with such an education has always been a struggle, and it remains one today. From the time the southern states made it a crime to teach an enslaved person to read, through decades of separate and unequal schooling which continue to the present, the right to learn in ways that develop both competence and community has been a myth rather than a reality for many Americans. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, African Americans faced de facto and de jure exclusion from public schools throughout the nation, as did Native Americans and Mexican Americans. And as I'll describe in a minute, that kind of segregation is redoubling in our schools today. The struggle for children's minds and opportunities was articulated in the great debates between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington about whether black children must be trained as laborers or might be educated in ways that could allow them to think for a living. And again, those debates are rejoined today in California when there's debate about the education of immigrant students and in other places across the country. It was also enacted in the ideological battles that shaped urban schools for the children of immigrants at the turn of the last century. So these themes continue. International assessments reveal today that America's schools are among the most unequal in the industrialized world in terms of spending, curriculum offerings, and teaching quality, and are only slightly less disparate than they were when Arthur Wise wrote Rich Schools, Poor Schools 30 years ago. In fact, most other countries fund schools centrally and equally, providing the same amount of money for each child's education, except in the cases where there are higher levels of need where they provide additional support. Here, there is a 10-to-1 ratio in spending between the highest spending districts and the lowest spending districts. There are districts in this country that spend $40,000 per pupil and districts that spend $4,000. And within a given state, there's a 3-to-1 ratio in most cases, with the rich getting richer and the children of the poor getting shafted. In 1991, Jonathan Kozol wrote Savage Inequalities. This past year, he published The Shame of a Nation, documenting again these inequalities. Recent analyses of data prepared for school finance cases, and I've been part of a number of these in Alabama, California, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Louisiana, South Carolina, Texas, and the list goes on, have found that on every tangible measure, from qualified teachers and class sizes to textbooks, computers, facilities, and curriculum offerings, schools serving large numbers of students of color have significantly fewer resources than schools serving more affluent and mostly white students. And while we're talking about leaving no child behind, or perhaps leaving no child untested, or perhaps no child's behind left is another version of that. While we're holding schools and students to higher standards, we're ignoring the unequal playing field that students and schools have to work with. This description of one San Francisco school, since we're here in San Francisco, serving African American and Latino students, was included in the Williams versus California complaint, and it's typical of many others. At Luther Burbank, students cannot take textbooks home for homework in any course subject because their teachers have enough textbooks for use in class only. For homework, students must take home photocopied pages with no accompanying text for guidance or reference when and if their teachers have enough paper to use to make homework copies. The school is infested with vermin and roaches, and students routinely see mice in their classrooms. One dead rodent has remained decomposing in a corner in the gymnasium since the beginning of the school year. The school library is rarely open, has no librarian, and has not recently been updated. The latest version of the encyclopedia in the library was published in 1988. Classrooms do not have computers. Computer instruction and research skills are not, therefore, part of the students' regular instruction. The school no longer offers any art classes for budgetary reasons. 2 of the 3 bathrooms are locked all day, every day. Students have urinated or defecated on themselves at school because they could not get into an unlocked bathroom. When the bathrooms are not locked, they often lack toilet paper, soap, and paper towels. The toilets frequently are clogged and overflowing. Ceiling tiles are missing and cracked in the school gym. And school children are afraid to play basketball and other games because they worry that more ceiling tiles will fall on them during the games. The school has no air conditioning. On hot days, classroom temperatures climb into the 90s. The school heating system does not work. In winter, children wear coats, hats, and gloves during class to keep warm. 11 of the 35 teachers have not yet obtained regular non-emergency teaching credentials, and 17 of the 35 only began teaching at the school this year. Some of those conditions have been ameliorated at that particular school because of the outcomes of the litigation, but this school, like those described by Jonathan Kozol, represents a growing number of apartheid schools that serve racial ethnic minority students exclusively, schools with little political clout where resources are extraordinarily impoverished. In California, for example, many such schools are so severely overcrowded that they run a multi-track schedule offering a shortened school day and school year, lack basic textbooks and materials, do not offer the courses students would need to be eligible for college, and are staffed by a parade of untrained, inexperienced, and temporary teachers. At a time when the earth is flat, when our future as a people is tied to our ability to learn, it's extraordinary the level of neglect that has been allowed to occur in this country. I'm going to ask my friends behind here to put on a video that they have available that's going to show you some of what happens in districts, this happens to be Oakland, California, where the investments needed to provide the basic elements of a right to learn are absent.
But there are classrooms without qualified math and science teachers. School systems say they just cannot find instructors. For example, inside this portable classroom at Bret Harte Middle School in Oakland, California, is an 8th grade math class that's been without a regular math teacher for most of the year. How many math teachers have you had?
Let's see, there is Mr. Berry, Miss Gaines, Mr. Lee, Mr. Dijon, Mr. Franklin. Coach Brown was one of our substitutes one day.
So we had Miss Nakasako, we had Miss Gaines, we had Miss Elmore, we had this other man named, he had like curly hair, his name was Mr. Aaron.
So you've had so many teachers you can't remember all their names?
Yeah.
A few miles away at Oakland High School, this 9th grade science class has had nothing but substitutes all year long. The entire year without a certified science teacher. Wow, what has that been like? Having, 16 teachers or 7 or 9 during the year?
It's just weird. It's like we have to get used to a new teacher every couple of weeks or so.
I'm feeling shorthanded because this is the 3rd year. Ever since I've gotten in junior high school, I haven't had a science teacher.
So you've had substitutes?
All 3 years.
All we learn is like the same thing all over again. When a new teacher comes, sometimes we gotta skip chapters and start all over again, and it's difficult.
Have you learned much science this year?
Nope.
Not really. Haven't had a chance to.
It breaks my heart.
Nancy Caruso teaches science at Oakland High School.
People have come from those classes over there and they come down and they beg me, can I get into your class? Please, I want to learn. I need a science class. And they're not getting it.
If we continue to roll that video, which came from a John Merrill production a couple of years ago, you would have seen that he found 3 certified science teachers who had applied to teach in the Oakland Public Schools and had never gotten a call to come in and for an interview or to take a job. And in fact, it has been and was, although again there's been some change in recent years, the practice to routinely hire substitute teachers and uncertified teachers rather than trained qualified teachers who applied in Oakland because they cost less money. Substitutes don't have to have benefits at the same level. Uncertified teachers earn a lower salary. And in the context of the severe budget shortfalls that so many districts have experienced, what gets sacrificed is the right of children to have a qualified teacher who can offer them a curriculum which would enable them to meet the standards that the state has imposed for them to be able to be promoted and graduated from high school to go on and have a possibility of making a life in our knowledge-based economy. And while these children are being thrown away in school systems, not only in this state but in others, we have here in Silicon Valley the effort to continually increase the number of visas for highly qualified technical workers, because we cannot supply from our public schools individuals with the skills and knowledge needed for the jobs, the high-tech jobs that we're producing. I believe this is the issue on which the United States' ability to continue to be a world power is going to rise or fall. And I think we are at the moment where we are either going to need to redouble our efforts in the way that other countries are doing in education, or we are about to watch the fall of Rome. And I think that, and that's what I'm going to speak to in the remainder of my remarks. I want to point out that these profound inequalities in resource allocations are supported by the increasing resegregation of schools over the last couple of decades. By the year 2000, more than 70% of the nation's black students attended predominantly minority schools, up significantly from a decade earlier. The proportion of students of color in intensely segregated schools also increased. Nearly 40% of African American and Latino students attended schools with a minority enrollment of 90 to 100%. These are the apartheid schools that are being neglected without much attention. Furthermore, for all groups except whites, racially segregated schools are almost always schools with high concentrations of poverty. Most urban schools are now majority, quote, minority, as is the state of California's public school system as a whole, and are significantly less well funded than their surrounding suburbs. In addition, within those districts, schools with high concentrations of students of color receive fewer resources than other schools within those districts, and within schools, tracking systems exacerbate the inequalities by segregating many minority students within schools, allocating still fewer educational opportunities to them at the classroom level. Studies show that students in lower tracks typically have lower quality teachers, fewer materials, less access to computers and other high-tech opportunities, and a much more diluted and weaker curriculum, typically oriented around rote skills, finishing worksheets, answering the questions at the back of the book, not the kind of education that would produce the capacities that W.D. Du Bois was talking about when he talked about a right to learn. It is not uncommon across this country to this day that you can walk into a 21st century school, which is about half students of color and half white students. It may be because it draws kids from many different attendance areas, affluent, middle class to poor, and you'll find the honors classes are still 90% or so white with some Asians, and the bottom track basic classes are virtually all Latino, African American. These compounded inequalities explain much of the achievement gap that bell curve proponents have attributed to genetic differences in intelligence, deficient child rearing, or a culture of poverty. The effects of this increasingly terrifying segregation and misallocation of resources is that in California, for example, the prison population is up by 400% over the last 20 years. The portion of our budget supporting the prisons has gone from about 3% to almost 15%, which is money that does not go into the education system for the lack of a few $1,000s more per pupil to ensure that these kids would have teachers who could teach them to read in elementary school. We're willing to spend $30,000 when they become young adults per pupil to send them to prison. The generation of young people who are experiencing this, and this is happening all across the country. Massachusetts joins California in being the first two states to spend as much on prisons last year as on higher education. So we have this huge divide occurring. Almost all of the individuals in prison are functionally illiterate, and it's really a function of the failure of investment in the education system that's going to deprive them of their futures and the society of the working, the effects of workers and contributors to our tax base, to our society, to our communities, to our livelihood that is being created in this tenacious insistence on clinging to unequal educational opportunity. Well, we know something about what makes a difference in achievement. For all the hand-wringing that we see whenever the test scores come out and the achievement gap is recognized, we know that teacher quality is one of the most important elements of students' learning and achievement. Teachers' qualifications and preparation, especially preparation to teach culturally diverse students in ways that attend to the learning process, not just getting through the book. And teacher experience. We know that teachers who have 3 or more years of experience are significantly more effective than the inexperienced teachers in their first and second years. We know that curriculum quality makes a difference, and that the kind of curriculum kids have access to determines more of their achievement than their initial ability level. If you take 2 students of similar ability levels and you track one of them into a more ambitious and challenging curriculum and one of them down into a more watered-down curriculum, their end result will be a function of the curriculum that they've received as well as the quality of teaching rather than their initial ability levels. So the theory of action behind a kind of differentiated curriculum that led to the tracking systems we have today routinely rations a thinking curriculum, a knowledge-based curriculum, to many fewer kids than can benefit from it. Some of you have had the experience as parents, and I've talked to many of you as we've raised our kids. I remember some conversations with Gloria Ladson-Billings when she was in Wisconsin and I was in New York. We were having the same experience. You come into the elementary schools, the tracking system often begins immediately. Who's going to be in the gifted and talented program? Who's going to be in the compensatory or basic program? There's only one section. We're going to ration opportunity to get access to curriculum to those who can test in, be selected in whatever, rather than expanding access to that curriculum to all of the kids who could do the work. When my first daughter went to elementary school, we brought her into a public school in first grade. She'd had a preschool that included a kindergarten. And we went through the school, which was a desegregation magnet. We were in the part of the community that was predominantly African American, and students from other surrounding parts were being bused in, white students, and they were trying to integrate the school. But if you went through and looked at the classrooms, they were predominantly segregated, and that's because of the gifted and talented magnet, which was serving mostly the students who were being brought in from the surrounding areas. And the reading classes, were obviously differentiated, but when I got to the math classes, there's this wonderful conceptual math curriculum. I actually knew the guy who had invented it in St. Louis, the CSMP curriculum. Some of you may have run across it. Really obviously preparing kids for algebra and trigonometry and calculus in high school. They were getting the conceptual underpinnings of mathematical thinking. And then there was a rote-oriented curriculum with memorizing math facts and spitting them back on time tests. And higher order curriculum was exclusively reserved to white students in this school. And I went to the principal and I said, what's going on with that class? How do you get into that? She said, well, that's for the highly gifted. And you have to test into that class in kindergarten. And I said, well, I really think that that's the curriculum that, kids should be getting. I certainly want my daughter to get that. And she knew a squeaky wheel when she could see one. She said, well, we'll let your kid, have a shot at testing into this, even though she's already in first grade and it's too late to be highly gifted. And I said, well, thank you very much. I'll take that, but I really think you need to expand this to the whole school. It was not designed. It was designed for urban kids in St. Louis. It was not designed to be a rationed curriculum. And so my daughter did, get put into that curriculum. She became the first African-American student in that curriculum, went up all the way through to the gifted and talented magnet in junior high school, which it was intended to create the streaming system for. But they did try to bring that curriculum to the whole school. And I said, yes, school reform, we win. And when I came back a couple of years later with my next daughter, it was back exactly to the way it had been. And it was back to that because as I asked the principal what happened, she said, well, we did do a couple of days of professional development that summer. We spread it across all the classrooms, but the teachers couldn't teach the curriculum. It was a combination of the content and pedagogical knowledge of the teachers, the lack of intensive professional development to enable them to learn how to teach a thinking curriculum to a heterogeneous group of students that ended up rationing the curriculum to many fewer kids than could have benefited from it. And over again, we see that the disparities in access to highly qualified teachers and our inability to prepare teachers to do what's necessary to give the kind of curriculum that kids need to all the kids who need it, that reinforces the inequalities that lead to the huge achievement gap that we continue to have. So these disparities in access to well-qualified teachers are large and growing worse. In California, for example, in 2001, the most segregated minority schools were more than 5 times as likely to have uncertified teachers than those in predominantly white and more affluent schools. Sometimes schools had as much as that 50% of their teaching force inexperienced and uncredentialed on a revolving door of attrition in and out. Similar inequalities have been documented in many other states. By any measure of qualifications, whether it's certification, content background for teaching, pedagogical training, selectivity of college attended, test scores, or experience, less qualified teachers are found disproportionately in these schools serving low-income and minority students. And solutions to the shortages created by unequal funding and poor working conditions rush more underprepared teachers into these classrooms as the primary approach at a significant cost to student learning. Some, especially expert witnesses fending off school reform lawsuits, say that this does not matter because teacher qualifications do not matter. Yet a number of studies across many states have found significant relationships between teachers' preparation, their certification, and student achievement. One study, Strauss and Sawyer, conducted in North Carolina, found that a 1% increase in teacher quality was associated with a 3 to 5% decrease in the percentage of students failing the state tests. And they concluded this way: of all the inputs which are potentially policy controllable, our analysis indicates quite clearly that improving the quality of teachers in the classroom will do more for students who are most educationally at risk, those prone to fail, than reducing the class size or improving the capital stock by any reasonable margin that would be available to policymakers. Defenders of the status quo argue that money doesn't matter and that student attributes like race and income account for almost all of the variance in student achievement. However, these are highly correlated with the availability of resources. And in the production function wars, the various kinds of analyses that look at the predictors of student achievement, you have to be able to disentangle the fact that who the kids are and what they get access to are so tightly correlated. So, for example, in an analysis we did in South Carolina, the proportion of kids who were minority and low income accounted for more than 70% of the variance in student achievement. But if you looked at school resources, those that could be measured with the limited data available, the differences in school resources accounted for 65% of the total variance in students scoring below basic on the state tests. Measures of teacher qualifications alone accounted for 64% of the variance in student outcomes. As elsewhere, the strongest predictors were the proportion of teachers without any training or certification and a measure of shortages through unfilled vacancies. The combined effects of school resources accounted for as much of the total variance explained as do measures of race and poverty. Similarly, in a recent study in Houston, a team of colleagues and I found that certified teachers outperformed uncertified teachers across 6 tests over 6 years, and that an uncertified teacher reduced achievement growth for a student by 3 months per year. So if you get 3 of those teachers over the course of your elementary instruction, you're going to lose at least a year of achievement. Similar findings in a New York study by Susanna Loeb, Pam Grossman, Don Boyd, Langford, and Wyckoff found similarly that teachers from college-recommended pathways produced higher achievement scores in reading and math than teachers who had been rushed into the classroom through alternative routes. They looked at the New York Teaching Fellows and Teach for America. Some of these other teachers became equally affected by the third year of practice, but as a group they left at such high rates, 50 to 75%, that the benefits of their training were lost. And as we think about the ways in which we bring teachers into the profession, it's important to think about the kids. If I learn to teach by the third year when I'm ready to leave, what happened to my students in the first year? And what happens to the students who have a first-year teacher who comes in underprepared over and over again? So much of our policy is organized around what we think about adults and their career paths, and so little is organized about what we think about the students' experience and what they are entitled to, whether, in fact, they have a right to learn each and every year from each and every teacher that they encounter throughout their school career. Although many who enter teaching believe they do not need specialized training before they enter, most quickly learn that teaching is more difficult than they thought, and they either desperately seek out additional training, construct a teaching style that focuses on control or simplifying, dumbing down the curriculum to what can be easily managed, or leave in despair. As one such teacher put it, I stayed 1 year. I felt it was important for me to see the year out, but I didn't necessarily feel like it was a good idea for me to teach again without something else. I knew if I wanted to go on teaching, there was no way I could do it without training. I found myself having problems with cross-cultural teaching issues, blaming my kids because the class was crazy and out of control, blaming the parents as though they didn't care about the kids. It was frustrating to me to get caught up in that. Even after only 3/4 of a semester at Berkeley, she went on to the UC Berkeley Developmental Teacher Education Program, I've learned so much that would have helped me then. It's possible to prepare teachers effectively for urban teaching, as this young teacher found out when she did find herself at the University of California in a thoughtful program that we ended up studying, a set of colleagues and myself, in a study of powerful teacher education programs, which is actually coming out from Jossie Bass next week, and you can order it in their booth here. We observed this particular teacher in action, and I just want to describe for you a first-year teacher prepared for successful urban school teaching and what's possible. And think about this description as you think about the students actually who are in Oakland getting no science teaching and what difference this makes. This is also in the same district. Maria teaches in a portable classroom in Wilson Elementary School in an urban California district. Wilson's 850 students, most of them language minority, are the largest population of Title I eligible students in the district. Now, by the way, I want to credit John Snyder, who was the researcher on this case study, who described this practice. Maria's room, a smaller than usual portable with a low ceiling and very loud air fans, has one kidney-shaped teacher table and 6 rectangular student tables with 6 chairs at each one. Maria has 32 first graders, 14 girls and 18 boys, no teacher's aide, 25 are children of color, including recent immigrants from Southeast Asia, African American students, and Latino students. Despite the small size of the room, Maria fosters an active learning environment with her active group of students. She's plastered the walls from floor to ceiling with student work, math graphs, student group experience stories, a student collage from Bringing the Rain to Kapiti Plain. Some of you probably know that book. The ceiling provides another layer of learning, hanging down so that the adults have to duck as they wend their way through the classroom, are student-constructed science mobiles and a variety of what we know and what we want to know charts. In one corner, a reading area is set up with books and a carpet, and cubbies that she and her husband built themselves hold the children's treasures. We visited her when she was meeting with some of her fellow teachers over lunch, discussing the afternoon science activity. And she was describing how she'd decided not to use the prepackaged curriculum, which had no way of engaging the children in learning about the properties of sinking and floating, had created her own hands-on activity, which would allow the students to get engaged in generating hypotheses and testing them and looking at data. She also described how she had retooled the language arts curriculum and the math curriculum to ensure that her students were actually engaging in critical thinking and problem solving. Once in the classroom, she groups the students in mixed language and gender cohorts, introduces the science activity. The room has got the materials, cups in large tote trays, 2 trays filled with salt water, 2 with regular tap water, small totes full of plastic bears and different kinds of tiles, quarters, rocks, paper clips, and the activity is to experiment with how many objects it takes to sink the cup in different kinds of water. The 32 students conduct experiments, recording on yellow stickies how many objects it takes to sink the cup, and then they place them on a large piece of chart paper that she's labeled in 2 columns, salt water and tap water. She reads the labels before the activity and asks the students to read them. She has them point out interesting language and spelling features. 2 of the children excitedly point out, that's the same weird spelling we saw this morning, referring to an earlier activity where the vocabulary was introduced. While organizing the groups, Maria gives directions for them to go to their assigned table and sit on their hands. This is one of the many management techniques she uses to assure that the students have the opportunity to engage in the work, because she knows they'll be unable to put their hands in the water while they're sitting on them. Once in the science activity, the management appears invisible. There's a little splashing and throwing things in the water, but the yellow stickies start to show up on the chart. The students regulate themselves, and then she brings the class together to generate hypotheses and match their hypotheses with the data. And when the language becomes more abstract, she asks students to come to the front of the room and demonstrate their ideas with the materials they had used. In California, this is one component of what's called Specially Designed Academic Instruction in English, or SDI, a pedagogical strategy that's focused on making content accessible to English language learners. And we saw many other examples of the use of SDI techniques, skillful use of cooperative groups, the development of performances and assessments that evaluate learning, the extensive use of visual cues, integration of first language and culture into the activities that showed that this first-year teacher could skillfully engage English language learners in the curriculum and bring them to a high level of competence. Instead of the impoverished classrooms we are so accustomed to seeing in urban settings, with little teaching and mountains of worksheets, assignments to read the chapter and answer the questions at the end, students socializing or putting their heads on their desks, all of Maria's teachers were learning in ways expected of much older students in much more affluent school settings. In this study, we saw teachers like Maria teaching in Milwaukee, Boston, San Antonio, New York City, and Charlottesville, well prepared to teach all students from their first days in the classroom. Their programs engaged them in intensive study of learning, child development, curriculum assessment, cultural contexts, and subject-specific teaching methods, as well as language learning methods, while they were undergoing at least a full year of student teaching with expert teachers who could model excellent teaching in diverse urban classrooms. Many of these programs had developed strong relationships with local schools. Some of them were formal professional development schools, rather like teaching hospitals where state-of-the-art practice is joined with state-of-the-art training. And some had even helped to start new schools that were models of state-of-the-art practice. It is possible to create this kind of teaching in urban schools, and evidence on teaching practice suggests that doing so results in stronger student achievement. But how would we do this at scale? There are 2 elements of what this nation needs to do to actually bring this kind of teaching to all students. The first has to do with professional policy that would be used to improve programs of preparation, and the second is the area of governmental policy to make access to high-quality preparation widely available. Let me talk for a minute about professional policy, because you don't uplift the quality of practice in any occupation without a means by which to transform the kind of preparation people routinely encounter as they become members of the profession. We saw in the programs that we studied the importance of a set of standards that had come originally from the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and were translated into licensing standards for the states, the Intasc Standards. Some of you may recognize that. And these really guided practice and performance expectations. We saw how those were translated in performance tasks and portfolios and rubrics that clarified the goals of preparation. And for a long time, the goals of teacher education were not very clear. I served with Governor Jim Hunt on a commission at one point. He chaired the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future, and many of you may not know that Governor Hunt originally was going to go into teaching. He was in an agricultural teacher education program. He still runs a farm, but he doesn't teach. And he said, you know, teaching was so hard, and I never knew what I was supposed to be able to do at the end of my student teaching. And I think he decided that being a lawyer would be easier. But that lack of clarity was certainly the case when I went into teaching. What were we supposed to be learning? What were the kind of performances necessary? That's been beginning to be addressed. There's also the importance of accreditation, which drove the changes in several of the programs we looked at, but has not been a major driver throughout the entire profession of teaching yet, because it's a voluntary activity. And so whereas all other professions have mandatory accreditation, and that's how medical education reform occurred. After Flexner did his Flexner report in 1910 on medical schools and the wide range of medical schools, you could become a doctor with 3 weeks of training. You would memorize a list of symptoms and a list of cures. I've seen the list. One of them said a shivery back gets a round of calomel, and it went on like that. Or you could go to Johns Hopkins University and have training in the sciences of medicine, a graduate level program, and an internship in a teaching hospital. That was the range. They moved toward serious preparation for all doctors because Abraham Flexner's brother was the head of the accrediting agency. And they basically incorporated into accreditation the requirement that a certain set of standards for preparation and practice would have to be met in order for in order for a school to be accredited, and you'd have to go to an accredited school in order to enter the profession. Well, we're still a long way from that in this country. About 700 of 1,200 schools of education are professionally accredited. And licensing standards and accreditation standards are part of the process of enabling practice to improve. It's also increasingly important that we create performance-based assessments of teaching ability. Most of the tests that teacher education programs are held accountable to under Title II of the Higher Education Act are basic skills tests and subject matter tests that don't test what schools of education are trying to do. They actually test the inputs to schools of education. Do you have your basic skills and your content knowledge, which, at least in states like California, is the input side of our statewide post-baccalaureate programs. We don't have a way to say how would we know that someone can teach, how would we guide schools of education around that, and how would we hold ourselves accountable professionally and move the profession with those kinds of assessments. We now know that the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards portfolio assessments are significantly linked to student achievement, that teachers who can demonstrate that they can teach through those portfolios are more effective. We know from some states like Connecticut that have had a performance assessment for beginning teachers that they are able to drive system-wide change and improvement in teaching practice through that. And we have in California now a consortium of 17 universities, public and private, that have developed their own performance assessment for California teachers that requires that prospective teachers develop a unit, teach a unit of instruction, be videotaped doing it, reflect on their teaching each day to say how they will change based on what the students did, demonstrate what student learning has occurred, analyze that student learning, reflect on their practice as the indicator of whether they're ready to enter teaching. Let's see whether you can actually teach. Guess what happens when you use that kind of a strategy to guide and evaluate preparation? Well, prospective teachers tell us that it changes their practice, that they learn an enormous amount from putting it all together and having to analyze whether they can, in fact, see growth in their students learning from what they're doing. As one said, the teach, assess, teach, assess, teach, assess process that they have to do each night when they prepare their portfolio helps you to understand that you're teaching based on what the children learn each day. That's the core of the kind of professional teaching we want teachers to do. Teacher education faculty who score the assessments say that doing that has helped them think about what it really matters in terms of assessing teaching and what matters in the preparation of teaching. Cooperating teachers who participate in helping candidates pass this assessment and who score it say that it helps them be clear about good teaching, what it looks like, what it sounds like. And induction program coordinators say that participating in this assessment helps them to get a much clearer picture of what new teachers will bring and what they'll be required to do. We can build on this, said one. So how we develop the capacity of the system to enable teachers to teach is partly associated with the professional accountability that the profession is willing to take on itself, as other professions have. But that won't do it all. Teachers also need different kinds of school organizations in which to do good work. And if we look at other countries, not only are teachers prepared differently, in most other countries that are at the top of the international assessments, teachers are getting 2 to 3 years of graduate level teacher education entirely at state expense with a stipend. Highly selected in and invested in, because their notion is that it's actually a contribution to the system to invest in all of the teachers that they will prepare. But then they go out into schools where they're likely to have mentoring. In Japan, they'll have 60 days in their first year of teaching for professional development. In most schools in Europe, Scandinavia, Southeast Asia, there'll be 10 to 15 hours a week that teachers work together, planning lessons, doing lesson studies, seeing each other's teach, coaching one another, preparing and scoring assessments. They will have not only that time for collaboration, but they're likely to work as teams around the same group of students, and they're likely to stay with the same students for 2, 3, or 4 years so that they come to know the students well and they can teach to the child as well as to the content. And they're likely to have the opportunity to teach around in-depth, authentic assessments and an in-depth curriculum, which will usually feature half as many topics in a year as we ask teachers to cover as they rush through the textbook. You know, we teach fractions in 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, and 9th grade for a couple of weeks each time as kids don't get it. Rather than in Japan where, for example, the first year of middle grades mathematics has 4 topics for the entire year, things like ratio and proportion, aka fractions. Estimation, deepening the understanding of integers. So they have a much more in-depth curriculum, and they teach to the kind of essay examinations, oral examinations, projects and products that are being squeezed out of our schools by a short-sighted accountability movement that is ratcheting down the curriculum for the most needy kids only to bubbling in one of the 5 answers on a multiple-choice test. So we have more to do than just preparing teachers. We have to redesign schools as well. And we need the incentives for that kind of transformation at the same time. I'm going to close with a couple of comments then about governmental policy. The kind of transformation and investment in schools of education that I've described in preparation for candidates could be done here as well. The federal government has, for over 40 years, invested in being sure that doctors are prepared in shortage fields and sent to shortage locations by completely underwriting their preparation. We once did that in teaching as well. We need a Marshall Plan to provide complete subsidy for teachers who will go into our high-need schools and teach in our high-need fields. If you are an able math teacher who wants to teach in Oakland or Chicago or Los Angeles or New York City, it should be a free ride to get the highest quality preparation we can provide you, rather than saying, go on in, we wish you well, sink or swim, and watching you burn out and leave. I've done the calculations, and virtually all of the positions that are currently filled by underprepared teachers could be filled with full subsidies to teachers for only $800 million a year, less than what we are currently spending in a single week in Iraq. And we could actually fully subsidize the preparation of all of the entering teachers each year for between $3 and $4 billion a year, about what we're spending in a single month in Iraq. So we have the capacity to think about how to prepare teachers differently in ways that other nations have already gone ahead and begun to do. Second, we need to create high-quality programs where candidates are most needed. Teachers are often tied to the communities where they grew up or the communities where they go to school. We need to build the highest possible quality teacher education programs in poor rural areas and urban districts where teachers can train in the kinds of programs that I described in professional development schools that exhibit state-of-the-art practice for the students who most need it, where training can go on. And federal grants like those that have been used in medicine to create centers of excellence and to develop community-based health facilities could do the same thing for these kinds of model teacher preparation programs. Some of these programs might target the paraprofessionals and other community residents who will stay in that community and become leaders if they're well prepared. Others may target mid-career recruits or newly graduated individuals. But rather than giving them 5 weeks of training and asking them to make do, we give them the kind of preparation that lets them stay and lead. The cost of such an initiative would be modest. 100 such programs located in the nation's largest cities at $1 million apiece for each of 5 years would cost only about $100 million, a small fraction of the cost of poor education and attrition these cities normally experience. In addition to these incentives for becoming prepared to teaching, it's critical to improve teacher retention, which creates the lion's share of teacher supply problems. About a third of beginning teachers leave in 5 years. Of course, the proportions are much higher in the highest need areas. Increasing the number of teachers who are prepared without addressing these high attrition rates is like pouring water into a leaking bucket. And that's been the process of most of our policy. The costs of teacher attrition are enormous. It costs between $8,000 and $48,000 per teacher to replace a beginning teacher who leaves each year, depending on whether you include in that the costs of learning differentials. One study estimated that this cost Texas as much as $2 billion a year. The cost for the nation is many, many billions. States could support mentoring programs that fund mentor time and training in partnership with the federal government for a small fraction of the wasted funds we're now paying as we leave kids in the position that you saw earlier. And finally, more is needed if we're to equalize educational opportunities to learn. We not only have to make schools become places worth teaching, the work that students are asked to do has to be worth doing. And that's the broader set of reforms that so many are working on. Adding special programs, as we often do, compensatory education, bilingual education, pregnancy prevention programs, truancy prevention programs, dropout prevention programs, to a system that is rotten at its core, that does not provide high-quality teachers in settings where they can know the kids well, where they can work well with their colleagues to develop thoughtful teaching and learning, is throwing money away. We have to really rethink the way that we conceptualize what school reform is about. It's not about supplemental services. It's about getting it right to begin with. It's about making those investments that on the front end will allow every child to have the kind of learning opportunities each year with each teacher that make them excited to learn, that give them the opportunity to think critically, to learn for empowerment, to learn, as Du Bois put it, what the leaders of other nations, people who think as we do and as we do not do, have thought, and what the world might be. John Dewey put it this way: what the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all of its children. Any other ideal for our schools is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. Some districts, some states in this country have pursued a set of purposeful policies that have actually enabled them to turn their systems around. Many more have not. Other nations are making these investments in ways that will leave us far behind if we don't come to understand the importance of every single child. That means that those of us who live in affluent communities have to be standing up when the conversation comes up about the funding of poor communities to say we care as much about the resources spent on children in that community as we care about the resources spent in the community where our kids go to school. We have to begin to articulate for people how we are all interdependent in this nation and how what happens for each one of the children in our schools is going to affect what happens for our own children and for those of the power brokers and the opinion leaders who make policy. It is possible, because we know how to do it, to imagine a day when all children will have access in every classroom to a caring, competent, and qualified teacher working in a school that's organized to support his or her success. And we should not settle for anything less than ensuring that all children have that right to learn. Thank you.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you, Linda. Linda's agreed to answer questions from the audience, so I'll once again turn the podium back to her.
I think we have about 20 minutes. Yes.
Linda, is this on? Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that very inspiring talk. One of the things that the principals and teachers with whom I work are constantly complaining about is the fact that they have to spend so much of their time and resources with students with disabilities. And when John Kerry was campaigning, I don't know if you heard this or heard him say it, but I did. Maybe it was in a moment when he was not so sane. He said he felt that the federal government should take care of all the expense responsibilities for special education, and that the rest of the funding that the states provide, the funding the states provide, then should go for children who did not have these special needs. Would you comment on those two things, please? The children with disabilities and the attempts to incorporate them in the classrooms and the time and expense that is, as well as the role of the federal government, perhaps, in alleviating that situation. Thank you.
That's a great question and an important one. Let me say something first about the practice of mainstreaming students with a variety of learning needs into classrooms, which has been going on over the last 10 or 15 years. It's extraordinary how that's progressed in different parts of the country. There are parts of the country where there's been real effort to prepare all teachers with knowledge of special education needs so that as kids are mainstreamed into their classrooms, they'll be prepared to deal with them. But in many parts of the country, that never occurred. Can you imagine saying to doctors, we've got a new approach to heart surgery, and we're going to mandate that, and we hope you can figure it out? This is a whole set of new teaching strategies. In the medical world, when you've got new technologies and new problems that are getting tackled, doctors will come, they'll study it, in a didactic way, they'll go watch another surgeon, in the gallery, then they'll be side by side, getting coaching to try it themselves before they go ahead into whatever the new set of strategies is. We've never done that around this issue of teaching students with a range of learning needs in mainstream classes in most parts of the country. So first of all, we need a whole overhaul not only of pre-service teacher education, which, as I say, has happened in some places. New York and Connecticut I think of as among the places that have been more on the forefront of this. In places like California, the likelihood for special ed teachers is that they will have completely untrained teachers and teachers' aides teaching them or responsible for that support, the so-called support for regular ed teachers that comes with the push-ins. So there's a whole moral responsibility to transform that the federal government also has a role in, that learning opportunities for teachers, which we've ignored. Now, the question of how we ought to fund special education needs is an important one because PL 94-142 anticipated that the federal government would take a much larger role in the funding than it has, and I think it may be something like 30 or 40% or maybe even less. I mean, it keeps dropping every year. Whether we'd want to put I think it's a good idea for the federal government to fully fund its promises under PL 94-142 and IDEA, which have not been pursued. Whether we'd want to rely only on the federal government for that portion of the budget, given the vicissitudes of politics at the federal level is another question that I think people would need to consider as they figure out how to pursue a federal, state, local partnership on this. But what's absolutely clear is that while we're making federal budget priorities over recent years with hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars going to cut taxes and wage war, these pressing educational issues that are causing us to fall further and further behind and become more and more divided as a society have not been addressed, and that's clearly something that many, many, many people have got to begin to put on the table. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. I can't help but I really related to the very last part of your talk, and I wanted to pick up just a couple of things that you said. As someone who's living here now but wasn't born in this country, and I very much appreciated your comments about what's happening in some other countries. The only thing that I do want to ask you about, I guess in a way question, but I suspect you'd be sympathetic to this, I think that one of the big problems, and maybe I'm sticking my neck out or putting my foot into it here, one of the big problems, if you like, is it's very deep-seated, goes way back to the way in which this nation, this country began in terms of its, last 400 or 500 years as a nation. And that is to do with the kind of moral underpinnings of the whole society and the way in which the notion of care, and you mentioned interdependence, has really been, I think, suppressed or submerged by this rampant individualism, which has meant that if you're good at what you do and you're a pioneer and you get ahead and you're free and you're successful, then you're a hero. However, if you fail, then we'll step on you. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry if that sounds a little bit melodramatic, but and of course you can see with racial and in other sorts of inequalities that are around, or racial groups that suffer inequalities, that just gets exacerbated. So I'm not just ranting here. I do have I guess, something to ask you or to propose, and that is, if that's right, or even half right, then it seems to me that there are some things which are even more important than literacy and numeracy, the kinds of things that are being focused on to a certain extent in No Child Left Behind, often to the exclusion of many other things. And that is teaching children to care for one another and to be in environments where they care for one another as they are learning. Now, there's only one place where that's actually realistically going to happen, and that's in classrooms. So it seems to me that understanding that problem also, in a sense, could point to the solution, but it requires somewhat of a tweaking, I think, of what you were referring to in terms of needing to remain competitive and so on and so forth. Thanks.
Absolutely. You sound like one of those soft-hearted educators,
I'm a philosopher, actually.
Can we measure that? How will we? I mean, clearly the whole set of issues around social responsibility, around citizenship, around raising children to become adults who will be community-minded is not very much discussed these days. Although there are plenty of people who are working hard on it in lots of schools, it's not something that's as much part of the national discourse. One of the schools that I work with, which is a new school that Stanford has helped to start, has a rubric that the kids get scored on every year for 4 years, which includes, along with critical and creative thinking and application of knowledge, social responsibility to their colleagues in the school and to their community, as well as personal responsibility. And you see how it transforms. Working on that set of issues in a variety of ways over the 4 years of high school transforms kids' whole attitudes towards what it means to be a human being and what it means to be part of a community. We need to be doing that in a much larger scale. But that's going to require a great deal of changing of the discourse. I was recently at a meeting in Japan, which is falling behind in the international rankings, and they brought in the Finns and the South Koreans to tell them why they're what they've been doing to cause their rankings on the international assessments to increase to such a high level. They're kind of 1 and 2 in the world now, coming from nowhere. And the South Korean representative was talking about their widespread reform, which is just extraordinary. They've gone from 10 or 20% of individuals in high school 2 decades ago to over 90% graduating from high school today, just that quickly. Talked about spirituality as being one of the elements of their goals and aspirations and the heart of their reform, right along with, math, science, critical thinking, and all the rest of it. So I think your point is very well taken, and it's a discourse that we have to continue to seek to be bold enough to raise and not ashamed to talk about, because it's not particularly reinforced. Somebody over there at the far.
Yes. Thank you. I'm so glad to hear about your concern for getting it right up front. I was formerly Director of Research for Durham Public Schools in Durham, North Carolina. And one of the things that we encountered there was the problem of closing the gap, of course. And yet every year we had kids there, we were closing the gap. The problem was that the gap existed when they came to Durham Public Schools. And it wasn't an ability gap, it was an opportunity to learn gap.
Right.
Jim Hunt, who you mentioned, also has emphasized the very, very importance of our youngest children. Recent research has shown that the cost of early childhood education pays for itself by middle school, and throughout their lifetime is a payback of $17 for every dollar invested. Yet I see very little acknowledgement by AERA or even an emphasis on the importance of having children ready to succeed in school. And I'd just like your opinion on this.
Well, I agree. You've said it very eloquently. Preschool is extremely important, and giving kids the opportunity to start learning early on is critical. And it's also important that those opportunities, as we kind of go through the standards-based reform process, continue to value the whole range of aspects of child development, and not just become, places where kids sit with little workbooks at the age of 3 or 4 rather than at the age of 7 or 8. And that's another thing that's getting contended in the early preschool movement. I'm reminded of a study that was done in Germany, in North Rhine-Westphalia, where they had the same debate that's going on about the nature of preschool that we're beginning to engage. They took 50 play kindergartens, as they called them, and 50 academic kindergartens, and followed the kids until 3rd grade, so they're about 9 years old, and found that the kids in the play kindergartens, which didn't mean that they were just running around playing, but that they had the opportunities to engage in a wide range of experiential learning, were far ahead of the kids in the academic kindergartens in every academic area, plus personal social responsibility, self-confidence, and so on. So I think, yes, we need to continue to talk about preschool, and we also need to talk about what goes in preschools that will enable kids to be truly ready as thinkers and understanders when they come into school, as well as more literate and ready to engage the school curriculum.
If I may.
Way over.
Thank you.
There.
Thank you.
Oh, we got two people way over there.
Okay.
Well, whichever one of you goes first, the next one will go second.
Okay. I'm from New Mexico, where there's a significant number of teachers who are working on alternative license or internship license, whatever you call it. They're coming to the classroom underprepared, take classes at night and on weekends while they're teaching during the day. And we're under significant pressure in schools of ed to create totally online alternative licensure programs to bring teachers into the classroom. And I wonder if you could speak to this trend to try to put teacher education classes totally online. I guess I'm looking for ammunition to take home.
I'm actually going to talk about this in another lecture in about 10, 15 minutes. But I really think that we have to resist, I think schools of education have to resist offering programs that they think will not be successful. Because you will be blamed for that lack of success, even if the willingness to participate in the devil's bargain comes from a generous and charitable place. Now, can some online classes be successful as part of a teacher education program? I actually think that having experienced some online courses that are quite good, very well structured and so on, there are some kinds of learning in some areas that can be partially conducted online. It's not impossible, or in fact sometimes it's a good way to deliver some kinds of information and instruction. But you cannot learn to teach, as you are clearly understanding, simply by taking online classes. That you need that placement in a strong school with an expert teacher who shows you what you're doing. You need the discourse with other colleagues who are also learning to teach, and with instructors and supervisors who are supporting that process, alongside any other means of accessing information, which will allow some efficiencies perhaps in the process. What's most tragic, I think, in the way that some programs are structured, although there are some alternative certification programs that are very high quality, and some traditional programs that are not high quality. So it's not kind of a matter of the label, it's more a matter of what goes on inside them. But when we do away with student teaching, when we do away with the notion that you should be in the classroom of an expert veteran who really demonstrates and models what good teaching looks like, we leave people, probably more than any other single aspect of various kinds of streamlined programs, we leave them without the opportunity to understand how to take what they might learn in courses and make it real. And so I think schools of education need to resist suboptimal ways of bringing people into the profession, because in the long run those recruits will suffer, and they'll tell us how they suffer. I've worked with so many teachers who were angry about their under-preparation, and the kids will suffer, and in the long run the schools of education also suffer.
Thank you.
I've seen you, heard you talk for a number of years now about
we were both very young when you...
It's true. It's all overtime. It doesn't really count as real years. About policies that affect the structure of public education at the state and national level, and you've certainly been eloquent about school-level practices. I have to tell you, after 30 years of school administration, I am increasingly alarmed at the deteriorating governance structure of school districts and the nature of who's sitting on our school boards these days, and the kinds of decisions that are being made, which seem to be more and more directly contrary to what's known from research and best practice about how schools ought to operate. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about a modern governance structure for school districts that might address that issue.
It's a really tough and interesting question. Part of our way of doing democracy in this country has been so tied to the notion of the lay school board, both at the local district level and the state level. But when you look at countries that are really transforming their education systems and bringing their students to much higher levels of learning, even as many other countries are becoming much more diverse and so on, quite often their capacity to engage deep and sustained serious reform that is based on research and our understanding of best practices, tied to the fact that they have a professional Ministry of Education that is staffed by individuals who are members of the profession and members and understand both practice and research, and they're protected from the politics. Very few other countries have lay school boards in the way that we do, that have the kind of power to say, sorry, we don't want to do that, and we're not interested in what the research says or what experience has been or whether it succeeded or failed. We just don't like it, and now we're going to do something else. And so that goes on, so we have very successful reforms of a variety of kinds that get stopped. And, then we go with the next change of the local or state school board or the intervention of a legislature around a new politics, a new ideology, whatever it is. We have these enormous pendulum swings. And, of course, it does lead to so many educators saying we tried that and we, either it didn't work or it did work and we stopped it and now we have to do something else and so on. It's really, really impeding our ability to build a system of schools that is compatible with what we know about learning, what we know about teaching, what we know about school organization. So, in the long run, I'd like to see the kinds of systems that, certainly at the state level in terms of departments of education, that much more resemble the ministries of education that some other countries have that are very, very professionally informed. And there was some study done in recent years of the sustained and very productive reforms that occurred in Connecticut from about 1985 to about 1999 or 2000. And a book that Susan Lucy wrote was on the professional State Department of Education, how it really functioned in that way, and still does to a substantial extent, where the best practices, the knowledge base of research and so on really drove that process. And I think, we know something about how to create that kind of setting, and that's something we really have to work on as we're also working in the trenches, because otherwise the work in the trenches will not be protected and sustained in the long run. I guess we'll come back over here and then we'll go over there. And then we'll have to stop.
Yeah. Thank you for your vision and your enthusiasm for hopefully transforming education. My question revolves around basically two different paradigms that are sort of accomplishing the same goal. One paradigm, it's the apartheid system. In Rhode Island, you would never think of busing students from one part of the state to the other, which is only about 60 miles. In Florida, that happens frequently, but unfortunately, we get the same results. There are low-performing students in schools that are segregated, like up in Rhode Island, and there are low-performing schools in Florida that are integrated, but still there's this apartheid mentality. What would you do systemically to not just think about creating these systems, but also making them happen?
Making which systems? Are you talking about getting rid of the apartheid structures?
Your ideal vision for education.
Right. One of the things I would do is we know a lot about how to build really good schools. We've done it over and over again in different eras of reform. We're doing it now. I would work to assemble the resources to build top-flight schools with the most modern technology, with the most supported teachers, with the right mix of class size and pupil load and school size, with the curriculum resources that are serious in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. And then I will, evidence suggests that then you can recruit in you can begin to reduce the apartheid structure, because where you offer spectacular schools, which we almost never do in the places that most need them, they become integrated over time. Now, then you have to be careful that the kids for whom you built the school don't get pushed out by the enthusiasm of the more affluent parents who then find their way in. But I think it's quite possible. It's been done in a number of settings, but we rarely sustain those. We've had, spectacular new small schools that have been created in communities. We've had magnet schools. We've had various kinds of interventions. What happens is that the power of parents, who has political power and clout, continues to come back at that school district level to then press on the reallocation of resources so that those who have more get more. And parents who have less clout are not able to withstand that. And many courageous school superintendents have fought these battles over and over again, and sometimes have won, and sometimes have not. So it's we have to really acknowledge. I think first we have to acknowledge the inequalities that exist in order to begin to transform the allocation of resources, including teaching resources, to the places where we want to see the kind of leading edge transformation. Last question.
Many people regard you, as I do, as a powerful voice in school reform. But I'm very curious to know if you feel like you are being listened to at the federal level in particular. Because my students, when I tell them as pre-service teachers about the requirements of No Child Left Behind, they can't believe it, that these structures are, they don't make logical sense even to my students.
I think, all of the folks who voted for No Child Left Behind, well, many at least, probably most, really were voting for the intentions of No Child Left Behind. I think it's a bill that has strong, powerful, important goals that was enacted by, for the most part, legislators who wanted to see those goals achieved. And there have been a variety of issues with the design and implementation of the very, very complex 1,000-page law that have surfaced that are now getting looked at for being addressed in the next reauthorization. And I'm hopeful that a lot of the glitches in the law that deflect it from its ability to achieve its goals in some cases, and in some cases there have been some benefits of No Child Left Behind, while there have been a lot of difficulties as well. I'm hopeful that those will get addressed in the next Congress, and I'm certainly working, as many people are, with folks who are working on that agenda and trying to make that set of fixes. The politics is very difficult. And the politics in an election year is very difficult. And so, the point at which reauthorization will occur gets pushed off, and meanwhile people in the trenches in many cases are battling and suffering under aspects of the law that are really dysfunctional. So it's a process, but all of these things are part of a struggle. It's important to be able to keep the long view that we need to keep to think about where we were in 1898 and where we were in 1950 and where we were in 1970 and where we are today, both to recognize some of the progress that's been made and how you have to keep at the chipping away to make things better, while also acknowledging that we have a very, very long way to go. So I think that many of us are working on the agenda locally and at various state levels and at the federal level. And many states have been very, very creative and thoughtful about how they're working to achieve the goals of that law without being hamstrung by its problems. And many of the folks in this room are working with those states as well. And we have to hold the faith, hold on to the plow, and keep at it. Thank you very much.